Oh snap, Nebula is the new Battle Pass card for May, and I think this card is so strong that I anticipate her to get nerfed in the next couple of months. We haven't seen a Battle Pass card since Zabu and Surfer get nerfed, but I'm pretty sure this one is going to prove to be too strong. Nebula is a unique card where in the leaks, we've seen her change power and cost quite significantly. Here, we can see that she was 4 energy and 6 power just a couple of months back, but now she is going to be released as a 1 energy and 1 power card. Her ability is as follows. Each turn your opponent doesn't play a card here, she gains 2 power, except the turn you play this. So the earlier you play Nebula, the better, and your opponent is going to be incentivized to play cards into her location every single turn. Here's how the maths checks out on Nebula. Assuming your opponent doesn't play any cards into Nebula's location, she can play for a maximum of 13 points. That's if you play her on turn 1 and Limbo is in play. Of course, this is very unrealistic, and a better way of looking at the maths is with the following graph. On the left here, we have the amount of turns your opponent has to play a card at Nebula's location, and then on the right, the amount of points Nebula plays for at the end of turn 6 if you played her on turn 1. So bear in mind, it's not just the amount of cards your opponent plays there, but they actually have to play these cards on different turns. So if your opponent plays no cards, Nebula's going to play for 11 points if you played her on turn 1, and that's by the end of turn 6. However, a more realistic number, for example, is 3 cards. They might play 3 different cards on 3 different turns into your Nebula's location, and therefore she'll play for 5 points, which is a pretty impressive total. If we compare this with other cards at 1 energy, cards like Titania have huge downsides where you're rewarded for playing them later, and often this 1 energy cut on turn 1 is wasted. It's only really Sunspot which is soaking up that value, and even if Sunspot was to play for 5 points, that would mean that you've wasted 5 energy elsewhere. Kitty Pryde is the other card, which is an engine type card, and that is also going to be coming into the game soon, so make sure you're subscribed for a breakdown on Kitty Pryde as well. So I think we can really evaluate the average points of Nebula if played on turn 1 to be around the 5 power mark. Some games it's going to be 3, some games it might be 7. So a very powerful card that you can play down early on. So here are the overall assessments on Nebula before we look at the big synergies. You want to play Nebula into unrevealed locations. Why? Well, just imagine you play Nebula and then the location reveals itself on turn 2 to be Death's Domain or Sanctumorium. Suddenly your opponent is going to have a really hard time playing cards into that location every turn, and your Nebula is going to play for an obscene amount of points, and you might just be able to snap there and then and secure a 1-cube victory in no time at all. The other thing, if you draw Nebula later on, you might want to consider playing Nebula into locations your opponents already have cards in. This is because the more cards they have in that location, the less cards they can play in there to block your Nebula growing in points. Nebula's an engine, so of course you want to play her earlier. I don't think there's any other card in the game which you would have access to on turn 1 which you would rather play instead of Nebula. The one maybe example would be Bast, because Bast buffs up Nebula by 2 points, but I would argue you would probably just end up wanting to play Nebula before the Bast anyway. Nebula is also going to be making your opponent's plays awkward and suboptimal, so even if they do manage to play in 4 different turns a card into Nebula's location, and she only plays for 3 points, well, 3 points is actually still not that bad at all for that 1 energy on turn 1, and you're going to be also making your opponent's plays pretty awkward as well, and forcing them to make plays they otherwise wouldn't. Okay, let's look at the synergy with Chavez, because this is an obvious one, and a lot of people underestimate the maths on Chavez, so I thought this was a quick opportunity to talk about my favorite card in the game. Without Chavez, you have a 12-card deck for the whole game. With Chavez, for the first 5 turns, you essentially have an 11-card deck. So you want to draw Nebula by turn 1, and without Chavez, you have a 33% chance of doing that, because you're going to see 4 out of your 12 cards before you play a card on turn 1. However, with Chavez, you're going to see 4 out of 11 cards, as Chavez is at the bottom and you cannot draw her, so a 36% chance. So you have around a 3% increase on drawing Nebula on turn 1 with Chavez. So Chavez, definitely a card which has quite a lot of synergy. 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of a game that is actually quite significant, particularly if there's also other cards like Bishop or Kitty Pryde which you want to draw early on as well. Storm. This is the one I'm most excited for, one of my favorite cards, and Nebula is absolutely insane with Storm. If you play Storm on turn 3, then Nebula is going to play for a minimum 5 points in a flooded location. That is, unless, of course, Jeff, Scarlet Witch, Reality Stone, these kinds of cards are played into the flooded location. Because your opponent is unable to play anything into Nebula's location on turn 5 and 6, and therefore she has 2 turns of growing by 4 points. She starts at 1, that's 5 points. Now, you could also play Nebula on turn 1, and that also means that your opponent would be forced to play a card there on turn 2, turn 3 and turn 4, and even then she would still play for 5 points. That is unbelievable. That's comparable to a Lizard, which is also making your opponent's plays very awkward as well. There's also some synergy there with Goose, because Goose is of course restricting the amount of cards your opponent can play into the location, and if your opponent wants to play something like a Doctor Doom, instead of having the luxury of playing it into the Nebula location to prevent those extra points on Nebula, they would not be able to because of the Goose. These are 2 of my favorite cards in the game, and a lot of Disruption decks are absolutely going to love the addition of Nebula into their arsenal. Speaking of Disruption cards which synergize very well with Nebula, we have Professor X and Spider-Man. To a lesser extent, I would say, than Goose and Storm, but of course on that turn 6, if you play Spider-Man or Professor X on turn 5, your opponent is going to be unable to play a card into that location, and therefore that's just going to be another way of getting some extra points out of Nebula. Ideally, you still play her on turn 1. They might give you a couple of turns where they don't play a card into her location, planning to play one on turn 6, but suddenly you Professor X or Spider-Man that location. And of course with Daredevil, that combo can become even better. We also have board clog cards like Green Goblin, cards like Debris, Titania. These cards are going to be reducing the amount of cards your opponent can play into Nebula's location. There's only 4 slots available opposite to Nebula, and therefore you could say each of these cards that you're clogging is potentially worth an extra 2 points on Nebula. And all these cards can synergize quite well together. Storm, you can absolutely play with these clog type cards because Storm is also restricting the amount of cards your opponent can play. Professor X and clog type cards work well with Daredevil. So Daredevil definitely working with the Professor X and Spider-Man, but also with these board clog cards as well. Also, cards like Cosmo and Negasonic Teenage Warhead, which are also control type cards, are going to make your opponent's decisions even more awkward. Imagine your opponent is playing an Electro ramp deck. They want to play their Electro into your Nebula, but you predict that and suddenly you Cosmo your Nebula lane, denying their Electro from even getting them that extra energy. That is just winning you the game on the spot almost. Negasonic Teenage Warhead could also be a big problem for them, particularly if you play it on turn 5. They might want to play their Doctor Doom, for example, on turn 6 into that location, or a big Hulk, something like that, and your Negasonic Teenage Warhead is going to be killing it. Pretty exciting. You could of course play this card on turn 6 as well if you had priority, and then they might get caught off guard by it. Some other counters, and well, just something to talk about of Nebula, is the fact she's 1 energy. This does mean Killmonger and to a lesser extent Elektra are obvious counters and ways of keeping this card in check. We have seen Sunspot kind of fall off a little bit with that 1 power loss, but Armor then could also make a big comeback into the meta as a way of protecting the Nebula. If we do see the Sandman nerf come through, you'll already know because I'm recording this before the Thursday patch notes have come through. If Sandman does get a significant nerf, it would not be surprising to see Silver Surfer decks and Serra control decks making a big impact on the meta, and Killmonger is very good in those kinds of decks. Of course, if you're playing Nebula and there's lots of Killmongers, you can slot in an Armor to protect it in a bunch of games, but you're not always going to draw the Armor with the Nebula. The other little bit of fun synergy in there is the other Guardians of the Galaxy. These 2 variants are the ones that you're going to be getting on the paid battle pass, because your opponent is likely to be playing many cards into your Nebula's location. You can be playing your Star-Lord, your Gamora, your Groot into the same location as Nebula. If they don't play anything there, cool, your Nebula gets +2. If they do, your Nebula doesn't grow, but at least you get that prediction right with the Guardian of the Galaxy. Valkyrie is also a subtle little bit of synergy. One thing you can do with Valkyrie is play Valkyrie on turn 6, and then a card like the Demon or Titania into your Valkyrie lane afterwards. Everything gets set to 3. If your opponent has 4 cards there, they're going to have 12 points. You're going to have 9 points plus that 1 cost card, something like a Titania, something like a Demon to just put you over the edge. However, if your opponent's location is already full and you have Nebula down in that location, it's also possible to play the Valkyrie into that location. Because they won't be able to play anything, your Nebula will get set to 3. You're at 12 points, they're at 12 points, so long as you both have 4 cards each. each, and then Nebula will grow by 2 points, winning you that location. So that's a really interesting bit of synergy to look out for, and I do have a spicy Valkyrie deck to share with you in the next couple of days. Okay, that is all of the information I have about Nebula. Let's reassess and come to our conclusions. I think this card is too strong. I actually think that this card might be good enough to play in pretty much any deck, so kind of similar to Sunspot. Now, not every single deck is going to be using Nebula, don't get me wrong, but I think that she's not just going to be good in decks with Storm, where she's going to be particularly good. I think she's going to be good enough to justify it in a whole range of decks. A deck like Shuri, for example, could make a comeback with Nebula added in there, because you already want to play Armor. You could be playing the Sunspot and the Kitty Pryde and the Nebula perhaps in a bunch of decks to just get this really early game presence. I really do expect her to get nerfed. I think she would be a lot more fair at 0 points. I think she's a very strong contender for the best cost card in the game. And Killmonger is going to be obviously the interesting thing. Killmonger might make a big comeback with Nebula being very popular. And like I say, I think Silver Surfer decks and Sarah Control decks, if Sandman does get nerfed, fingers crossed, which you will already know at this point, those decks should be very, very high in the meta anyway, and that could keep Nebula in check. Of course, you can play Armor, but it's not like you're going to be drawing Nebula and Armor all together. So that's my assessment of Nebula. Really excited to share with you in a couple of days my favorite decks for her, because there's a lot. Hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a like if you did, and let me know in the comments if there's any other synergies I've missed out on, if there's anything you're particularly excited to play with Nebula. See you on the next one.